The candles had barely been lit when the first cruel laugh rang out across the ballroom floor, and Clara Bennett froze at the top of the marble staircase, her gloved hand tight on the railing. She had not even stepped fully into the room yet, and already something was wrong. A young man stood near the center of the polished floor, his hands twisting nervously behind his back, while three young women in bright silk gowns turned away from him one after another, their laughter sharp and pointed, meant to be heard. Clara did not know his name yet. She only knew the look on his face. It was the look of someone who had been hurt this way many times before, and who kept hoping, foolishly perhaps, that this time would be different. She had been invited to Wrexham Hall through her Aunt Agnes, who served as companion to Lady Beatrice Ashworth, the Duke's stern and watchful aunt. Clara was not born to this world of chandeliers and diamond pins. Her father ran a modest shop in the village of Elmsworth, and her mother mended dresses for half the ladies who now swept past Clara without a second glance. She had worn her best gown tonight, a pale blue muslin that had taken her mother 3 weeks to finish, and she had told herself she would simply watch, smile politely, and leave before anyone noticed how out of place she felt. But watching the young man's face fall again, watching him step back with his shoulders curling inward as if trying to make himself smaller, Clara felt something twist inside her chest that had nothing to do with her own nervousness. "That is Lord Henry," a voice murmured beside her. It was her Aunt Agnes who had appeared at her elbow, fan half raised to hide her mouth. "The Duke's younger brother, poor soul. He took a terrible fever as a boy and he has never quite been right since. Slow, some call him. Simple. He means no harm, but the young ladies do not care to dance with him. It makes for an awkward scene every single year." "Every year?" Clara asked. "Oh yes. The Duke insists his brother attend every ball held at Wrexham Hall. He will not hide him away as some families might. But I do not think the Duke realizes how it wounds him, watching from the side like that, unable to do a thing about it without making it worse." Clara followed her aunt's gaze across the room and saw him then, for the first time. The Duke of Wrexham stood near one of the tall windows, a glass of wine untouched in his hand, his dark eyes fixed on his brother with an expression Clara could only describe as quiet agony. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of composed face that had likely never once betrayed weakness in public. And yet there, in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands, Clara could read exactly what her aunt had described: helplessness. The particular helplessness of a man who could command an entire estate and hundreds of servants, yet could not make a single young woman be kind to his brother. The orchestra began a new song, a lively reel, and Lord Henry's face lit with sudden hope. He turned toward a cluster of young ladies near the refreshment table, his steps eager, almost stumbling in his hurry. Clara watched Miss Harriet Vale, a girl she recognized from the village assemblies, lean toward her friends and whisper something behind her fan. The group broke apart in practiced unison, each young lady finding somewhere else to be, a lost glove to search for, a mother to attend to, a breath of air to take by the terrace doors. Within seconds, Lord Henry stood alone again in the middle of the floor, his outstretched hand slowly falling back to his side. Something in Clara's chest ached fiercely at the sight. She thought of her own brother, younger than her by 6 years, who had been born with a weak leg, and had spent his childhood being mocked by other boys in the village until Clara herself had put a stop to it, more than once, with words sharper than any of them expected from a shopkeeper's daughter. She knew what it looked like when kindness was withheld simply because someone was different. She knew, too, what it looked like when someone finally decided they had watched enough. "Aunt Agnes," Clara said quietly, "will you excuse me for a moment?" Her aunt's eyebrows rose. "Clara, what are you?" But Clara was already moving, weaving between clusters of guests, her heart pounding harder with every step. She did not know this young man. She did not know the Duke, or the rules of this grand house, or what whispers might follow her for the rest of the evening. She only knew that she could not stand at the edge of the room and watch this happen one more time. Lord Henry did not notice her approach at first. He was staring down at his own hands, his lips pressed together in the particular way of someone trying very hard not to show that he was hurt. Up close, Clara could see he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps only a year or two older than herself, with the same dark hair and strong brow as his brother, though his eyes held something softer, more open, entirely without the guarded caution that seemed to live behind the Duke's gaze. "Excuse me," Clara said gently, "would you care to dance?" Lord Henry's head snapped up so quickly that Clara nearly laughed, though she held it back, sensing it was not a moment for laughter of any kind that might be mistaken for mockery. "Me," he said, and then, as though correcting himself for having doubted her, "You mean me." "I do," Clara said, and she offered her hand. Across the room, though Clara could not see it, the Duke of Wraxham went very still. His wine glass paused halfway to his lips. For one long moment, he simply watched, certain he had misunderstood what he was seeing, certain that this stranger in the pale blue gown would find some excuse and slip away just as all the others had. But Clara did not slip away. She placed her hand firmly in Lord Henry's, and though his fingers trembled slightly against hers, his face broke into a smile so wide and so unguarded that several nearby guests turned to look, startled by the sheer brightness of it. "I do not dance very well," Lord Henry admitted quickly, as though he needed to warn her before it was too late to change her mind. "I count wrong sometimes. My brother says it does not matter, but the others do not like it." "Then we shall count together," Clara said. "I am not very good either, if I am honest. My feet have a mind of their own." He laughed then, a real laugh, sudden and delighted, and led her onto the floor just as the orchestra swelled into the opening bars of the reel. Whispers rippled outward from the dance floor like water disturbed by a stone. Clara heard fragments of it as she took her place across from Lord Henry, heard the words "shopkeeper's niece," and "has she gone mad, and would you look at that?" But she did not turn to see who was speaking. She kept her eyes on Lord Henry's face, on his fierce concentration as he tried to remember the steps, on the way his tongue poked slightly from the corner of his mouth when he counted under his breath. He missed a step almost immediately, turning left when he should have turned right, and his face flushed with sudden panic, certain this was the moment she would abandon him just as the others had abandoned him. But Clara only laughed, a warm and easy sound, and reached out to gently turn him back the correct way. "There," she said, "now we match." The panic drained from his face as quickly as it had come, replaced again by that wide, unguarded smile. He found his rhythm after that, clumsy in places but earnest in every movement, and Clara matched her own steps to his so that neither of them ever looked out of place, only joyfully, imperfectly together. Near the window, the Duke of Wraxham had not moved. His wine glass remained forgotten in his hand, warming slowly, entirely ignored. He watched his brother laugh, watched him spin with genuine confidence for perhaps the first time Edmund could remember at any gathering of this size, and something in his chest, some old and familiar ache that he had carried for years without ever naming it aloud, shifted painfully, hopefully, toward something he did not yet dare to call relief. He did not know the young woman's name. He did not recognize her gown, nor her face, nor the particular way she tilted her head when she laughed at something his brother said. He only knew, with a certainty that startled him, that he needed to know who she was, and why, out of every guest in that crowded ballroom, she alone had chosen to see his brother rather than look away from him. "Edmund?" His aunt's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and disapproving even in a whisper. Lady Beatrice had appeared at his side without his notice, her painted fan snapping shut against her palm. "Do you know that girl?" "No," the Duke admitted. "Then you had best find out," Lady Beatrice said, though her tone suggested this was not entirely a compliment to Clara. "Half the room is already talking, and not kindly. A shopkeeper's family dancing with Lord Henry. It will be the whole scandal of the season by morning." The Duke said nothing to this. He was still watching the dance floor, still watching his brother spin clumsily and joyfully in the arms of a stranger who had not once glanced toward the Duke himself for approval or reward, who seemed, in fact, entirely unaware that anyone of importance was watching at all. The music built toward its final measures. Lord Henry, growing bolder, attempted a small flourish that Clara had not taught him, nearly stumbling, and Clara caught his arm without hesitation, steadying him with a laugh that carried clear across the floor. He laughed too, loud and unashamed, and for one bright moment the entire ballroom seemed to fall away around them, leaving only the two of them and the music and the simple, undeniable joy of being seen. The dance ended. Lord Henry bowed, deep and formal, exactly as he had likely been taught, and Clara curtsied in return, her cheeks flushed with warmth that had nothing to do with the heat of the crowded room. "Thank you," Lord Henry said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words, thick with an emotion he did not try to hide. "No one has ever asked me first. They only dance with me if my brother makes them." Clara's throat tightened at this admission, delivered so plainly, without any trace of self-pity, only simple honesty. "Then they have been very foolish," she said, "because you are an excellent partner and I am glad I asked." She did not yet know that across the room, the Duke of Wraxham had set down his wine glass entirely and begun to walk toward them, his long strides cutting purposefully through the crowd, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that would, within moments, change the entire course of her evening, and though she could not have guessed it then, the entire course of her life. Clara felt him before she saw him, a shift in the air around her, a sudden hush among the nearby guests as though a stone had dropped into still water. She turned, still slightly breathless from the dance, and found herself looking up into the dark eyes of the Duke of Wraxham himself. Up close, he was even more imposing than he had appeared from across the room. His evening coat was cut with the kind of quiet perfection that spoke of wealth so old it no longer needed to announce itself, and his expression, though composed, held none of the coldness Clara had expected from a man of his rank. Instead, there was something raw in his face, something almost unguarded, as though he had walked toward her before he had fully decided what he meant to say. "Miss," he began, and then stopped, clearly realizing he did not know her name. "Bennet," Clara supplied, dropping into a curtsy that she hoped did not betray how quickly her heart was beating. "Clara Bennet, Your Grace." "Miss Bennet," he said it slowly as though testing the shape of it, "I must thank you. For my brother—" Lord Henry, still standing beside Clara and glowing with the particular happiness of a man who had just danced for the first time without being humiliated, beamed up at his brother. "She asked me first, Edmund, before anyone made her." Something flickered across the Duke's face at this, quick and complicated, gone before Clara could fully name it. Guilt, perhaps, or grief. "Did she?" he said quietly. "I did," Clara confirmed, and found herself lifting her chin slightly, unwilling to let the Duke's obvious authority intimidate her into silence. "Your brother is a fine dancer, Your Grace. He only needed a partner willing to be patient." "Patience does not seem to be in abundant supply this evening," the Duke said, and there was an edge to his voice now, faint but unmistakable, directed not at Clara but at the room around them, at the young ladies who had turned Lord Henry away only minutes earlier and now watched this exchange with poorly hidden curiosity. "No," Clara agreed simply, "it does not." For a long moment, the Duke said nothing at all. He simply looked at her, in a way that made Clara acutely aware of the plainness of her gown against the silk and jewels surrounding her, of the fact that her family owned a shop rather than an estate, of every single reason she did not belong in this ballroom. And yet his gaze held no judgment in it, only something closer to wonder, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle he had not expected to encounter tonight. "Would you do me the honor of the next dance, Miss Bennet?" he asked. The words seemed to ripple outward through the crowd almost instantly, gasps and whispers rising like a tide. Clara heard Miss Harriet Vale's sharp intake of breath somewhere behind her, heard someone murmur the word unthinkable in a tone that suggested delight rather than disapproval, the particular delight of witnessing a scandal unfold in real time. Clara hesitated only a moment before answering, "I would be honored, Your Grace." The orchestra struck up a slower piece, a waltz, and the Duke offered his arm. Clara placed her gloved hand upon it, and together they moved toward the center of the floor, the crowd parting before them in a way it had certainly not parted for Lord Henry only minutes before. You must forgive the staring, the Duke said as they began to move through the steps, his hand warm and steady at her waist. It is not every day that Wraxham Hall witnesses a Duke dancing with a lady he has only just met, following a dance most of the room considered beneath their notice. I did not consider it beneath my notice, Clara said. I considered it unkind that no one else had. The Duke's mouth curved, not quite a smile but close to one. You speak plainly. My father says it is my greatest fault. I think, the Duke said, his voice quieter now, meant only for her, that it may be your greatest virtue. Clara felt her cheeks warm at this, and she was grateful for the low candlelight that she hoped disguised the color rising in them. She had not expected the evening to unfold this way. She had come only to please her aunt, to stand quietly at the edges of a world she did not belong to, and instead she found herself waltzing with a Duke while half the room watched with open astonishment. Your brother is fortunate to have you, she said, choosing to steer the conversation away from herself. Not every family would insist he attend such gatherings. Many would keep him hidden away, out of sight, out of embarrassment. Something shifted in the Duke's expression, a flicker of old pain surfacing briefly before he mastered it. I considered it once. After our parents passed and the responsibility for Henry fell to me alone, it would have been simpler, certainly. Fewer whispers, fewer scenes such as the one you witnessed tonight. But Henry loves music. He loves the dancing, the candles, the noise of it all, even when it wounds him. I could not bring myself to take that from him, simply to spare myself the discomfort of watching him be hurt. That is not simplicity you are avoiding, Clara said softly. That is love. The Duke looked at her then with an intensity that made her breath catch, as though she had said something he had needed to hear for a very long time, and had never once expected to hear from a stranger at his own family's ball. You are an unusual young woman, Miss Bennet. I have been told that as well, Clara said, and this time she allowed herself a small smile, usually not as a compliment. I meant it as one. They danced in silence for a moment after that, the music swelling around them, and Clara became gradually aware of just how many eyes were upon them, how many fans were raised to hide whispered speculation, how many mothers were nudging their daughters and murmuring something that was surely not kind. She thought of her own mother, waiting at home with her needle and thread, and wondered what on earth she would say when Clara returned tonight with a story too strange to be believed. When the waltz ended, the Duke did not immediately release her hand. Miss Bennet, might I ask where your family resides? In Elmsworth Village, Your Grace. My father keeps a shop there, cloth and notions mostly, and my mother does fine needlework for the ladies of the parish. She watched his face carefully as she said this, bracing herself for the subtle shift she had seen so many times before in the eyes of gentlemen who discovered a lady's modest origins, the polite retreat, the sudden coolness. But the Duke's expression did not change at all, save for a slight tilt of his head, as though this information only deepened his interest rather than diminishing it. Elmsworth is not far from here, he said. I believe I have ridden through it more than once. Then perhaps you have seen our shop, Your Grace, though I doubt a Duke has much need of buttons and ribbon. He laughed at this, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even himself, quickly muffled behind a composed expression as several nearby guests turned to look. Perhaps not, though I begin to think I have been missing something rather important in Elmsworth all this time. Before Clara could formulate a reply to this, a voice cut smoothly between them. Your Grace. How very good to see you enjoying yourself this evening. Clara turned to find a tall gentleman approaching, his coat cut in the very latest fashion, his smile polished to the sort of perfection that Clara instinctively distrusted. She recognized him vaguely from gossip her aunt had shared, a Lord Gerald Pratt, a distant cousin of the Ashworth family with expensive tastes, and according to rumor, considerably less fortune than his manner suggested. Lord Gerald, the Duke said, his tone cooling noticeably, I did not know you had been invited. Your aunt was kind enough to extend the courtesy, Lord Gerald said smoothly, his eyes sliding toward Clara with open curiosity. And who is this charming young lady? I confess I do not recognize her from any of the usual circles." "Miss Clara Bennet," the Duke said, and something in the way he said her name, faintly protective, made Clara's pulse quicken. "Of Elmsworth." "Ah," Lord Gerald's smile did not waver, but something colder entered his eyes, quickly hidden. "How refreshing to see new faces at Wrexham Hall. Miss Bennet, might I request the next dance?" Clara glanced instinctively toward the Duke, uncertain of the etiquette required in refusing a request she had no genuine desire to accept. But before she could answer, Lord Henry appeared suddenly at her side, his face bright with an idea that had clearly just occurred to him. "She promised me another dance," Lord Henry announced, entirely without guile, tugging gently at Clara's sleeve. "Did you not, Miss Bennet? You said we would count together again." Clara had said no such thing, not in those exact words, but she seized the excuse gratefully, offering Lord Gerald an apologetic smile that held not a trace of genuine regret. "I did indeed promise. Forgive me, Lord Gerald, perhaps another time." Lord Gerald's smile thinned slightly at the edges, though he bowed with practiced grace. "Of course, I shall look forward to it." As Lord Henry led her back toward the dance floor, glowing with pride at his own cleverness, Clara glanced back once toward the Duke and found him watching her still, an expression on his face that she could not quite name, though it made her heart beat strangely fast beneath her gown. Behind him, Lord Gerald had not moved, his gaze following Clara across the room with a calculation that had nothing to do with charm at all, and everything to do with the sudden, unwelcome realization that a shopkeeper's daughter had, within a single evening, captured the attention of a duke he had spent years courting for his own advantage. The night stretched on, full of music and candlelight and the particular electricity of a room that sensed something significant had happened within it, though none of the guests, not even Clara herself, yet understood the full shape of what that something would become. Clara did not sleep that night. She lay awake long after her mother had blown out the last candle, staring at the low ceiling of their small bedroom above the shop, replaying every moment of the ball in her mind until the details blurred together like watercolors left out in the rain. The warmth of the Duke's hand at her waist, the particular way Lord Henry's face had lit when she asked him to dance, the cold, assessing look in Lord Gerald's eyes, so carefully hidden behind his polished smile. By morning, the whole of Elmsworth seemed to already know. Clara had barely opened the shutters of her father's shop when Mrs. Doyle, who ran the bakery 2 doors down, appeared at the counter breathless with news she clearly could not wait to share. "Is it true, Clara? Did you truly dance with the Duke himself at Wrexham Hall? My niece was there as a maid helping serve the punch, and she says half the ballroom nearly fainted when he asked you." "It was only a dance, Mrs. Doyle," Clara said, though she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks as she measured out a length of blue ribbon for the woman's order. "Only a dance," Mrs. Doyle repeated, delighted. "Only a dance," she says. "Wait until your mother hears how the whole village is talking of nothing else." Her mother had, in fact, already heard, and by the time Clara returned home for the midday meal, Eliza Bennet was in a state somewhere between terror and pride, wringing a dish towel in her hands as though she might strangle the truth out of it. "A duke, Clara, a duke danced with you. Do you understand what people will say? Do you understand what they will expect?" "I do not care what they expect, mother. I care that Lord Henry was treated cruelly, and I would do the very same thing again tomorrow." "That is not the point," her mother said, though not unkindly, sitting heavily at the small kitchen table. "The point is that a man such as the Duke of Wrexham does not simply dance with a shopkeeper's daughter and forget her by morning. Either he intends nothing further, in which case the whole village will pity you for having been noticed and then discarded, or he intends something more, in which case—" She stopped, shaking her head slowly. "In which case there will be trouble from every direction, Clara. His family will never accept it easily. Lady Beatrice alone could make your life very difficult." Clara had no answer for this, because in truth she did not know which possibility frightened her more. She found out the answer 3 days later, when a carriage bearing the Ashworth family crest rolled to a stop outside her father's shop, drawing half the street to their windows to watch. The Duke himself stepped down, dressed more simply than he had been at the ball but no less commanding, and Clara's heart climbed into her throat as she watched him approach the shop door with the same purposeful stride she remembered from across the crowded ballroom. "Your Grace," her father said, bowing so deeply that Clara feared for his back, clearly torn between astonishment and the instinct to offer his very best bolt of silk to a customer of such rank. "What an honor! What may we—" "I have not come to purchase anything, Mr. Bennet," the Duke said, though his tone was gentle, entirely without the coldness Clara's mother had feared. "I have come to speak with your daughter if she is willing and if you would permit it." Clara's father glanced toward her, uncertain, and Clara stepped forward before her nerves could betray her. "I am willing, your Grace." They walked together along the narrow lane behind the shop, where a small garden of herbs and late summer flowers grew in untidy rows, Clara's mother watching anxiously from the kitchen window, though she pretended otherwise. "I owe you an apology, Miss Bennet," the Duke began, once they were far enough from prying ears. "I did not consider, when I asked you to dance, how much difficulty it might bring upon you and your family. The gossip has reached even Wraxham Hall. My aunt is beside herself." "I am not sorry for it," Clara said simply. "Are you, your Grace?" He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, the careful composure he wore like armor slipping just slightly. "No," he admitted. "I find that I am not sorry at all. I find, in fact, that I have thought of very little else these past 3 days." Clara's breath caught, though she tried to keep her voice steady. "Nor have I, your Grace, if I am honest." "Henry has asked after you every day," the Duke continued, and a real smile touched his mouth now, the first genuine one Clara had seen from him. "He has decided you are his particular friend, and has informed the entire household staff of this fact no fewer than a dozen times. He wishes to know when you will visit again." "I should like that very much," Clara said, and meant it entirely. "There is something else," the Duke said, more hesitant now, choosing his words with visible care. "My aunt believes, and I suspect much of society will agree with her, that a friendship between yourself and my brother, however innocent and however good for him, is one matter, easily forgiven as charity. But any deeper connection between yourself and myself is quite another. She has already begun making inquiries into more suitable matches for me. Lord Gerald, in particular, has taken it upon himself to remind her at every opportunity that a duke's attention ought to be spent more wisely." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach at the mention of Lord Gerald's name, though she could not have said precisely why. "And what do you believe, your Grace?" The Duke stopped walking and turned to face her fully, the late afternoon sun catching the dark strands of his hair, and for a moment Clara forgot entirely to breathe. "I believe," he said slowly, "that I have spent a great many years doing precisely what was expected of me, managing the estate, guarding my brother from a world that has rarely been kind to him, choosing at every turn the sensible course over the one that might bring me any true happiness. And I believe that watching you dance with Henry, watching you see him the way so few others ever have, was the first time in longer than I can remember that I felt something other than duty." Clara did not trust herself to speak for a moment, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "I do not say this to press you into anything you are not ready for," the Duke continued quickly, as though worried he had overstepped. "I say it only because I think you deserve honesty, given the difficulty my attention has already brought upon you. If you wish for me to withdraw entirely, to spare you and your family further gossip, I will understand." "I do not wish that," Clara said before she could stop herself, and watched relief and something warmer flood across his face in equal measure. "Though I confess I do not know how any of this is meant to work, your Grace. I am not a lady of your world. I know nothing of it, and I suspect I would embarrass you terribly if you tried to introduce me into it properly." "You did not embarrass me at the ball," the Duke said. "You were the only person in that entire room who behaved with any real grace at all." They talked for a long while after that, standing in the small, untidy garden as the afternoon light faded gold and then gray. And by the time the Duke finally took his leave, promising to call again soon and to bring Lord Henry with him, Clara felt as though something fundamental in her life had shifted, quietly but irrevocably, like a door opening onto a room she had not known existed. She did not see the figure watching from the shadow of the lane's far corner, nor did she hear the soft, displeased sound Lord Gerald made as he turned his horse and rode back toward Wrexham Hall, already composing in his mind the letter he intended to send to Lady Beatrice that very evening, a letter carefully worded to plant doubt where none yet existed, to suggest that Clara Bennet's sudden favor with the Duke was not nearly so innocent as it appeared, and that a young woman of her modest circumstances might have motives considerably less pure than kindness toward a simple young man who could not see cruelty coming even when it stood directly in front of him. By the time the Duke's carriage rolled back through the gates of Wrexham Hall that evening, Lady Beatrice was already waiting in the drawing-room, her face set in the particular expression that Edmund had learned over many years to recognize as trouble. "I have heard the most troubling things, Edmund," she said, without preamble, the moment he entered, "about the shopkeeper's daughter and her intentions toward this family." "Whatever you have heard, Aunt, I would ask you to consider the source before you believe it," the Duke said, though something uneasy had already begun to stir in his chest. "The source," Lady Beatrice said coolly, "is a family friend who has only this family's best interests at heart. And what he suggests, Edmund, is worth your consideration, whether you wish to hear it or not." The Duke said nothing, though he felt, for the first time since the ball, the cold, creeping edges of doubt begin to close in around the warmth he had carried with him all the way home from Elmsworth. And somewhere in the house above them, Lord Henry sat by his window humming the tune of the reel he had danced only days before, entirely unaware that the fragile happiness his brother had found might already be under quiet, deliberate attack. "What exactly does Lord Gerald suggest?" the Duke asked, his voice carefully level, though his hands had gone still at his sides in a way that betrayed how little he wished to hear the answer. Lady Beatrice unfolded a letter from her sleeve, the paper already creased from repeated reading. "He suggests, Edmund, that Miss Bennet's sudden kindness toward Henry was no accident of chance, but a calculated first step, designed to draw your attention and your sympathy, knowing full well how deeply you love your brother and how desperately you wish to see him treated with kindness. He suggests that a young woman of her situation, with no fortune and no connections, would have every reason in the world to seek exactly such an opportunity, and precious few scruples standing in her way." "That is a vile accusation," the Duke said sharply, "and I do not believe it for a single moment." "Perhaps not," Lady Beatrice said, though her tone remained maddeningly composed. "But you must admit, Edmund, that it is not impossible. You know nothing of this young woman beyond a single evening's acquaintance. You do not know her character, her history, her true intentions. You know only that she performed a kindness in front of a room full of witnesses, at precisely the moment you were most likely to notice and be moved by it." The Duke wanted very much to dismiss this entirely, to tell his aunt that she had never met Clara Bennet, had never seen the plain honesty in her face or heard the genuine warmth in her voice when she spoke of his brother. But a small, unwelcome seed of doubt had already lodged itself somewhere beneath his certainty, and he hated himself faintly for the fact that it had taken root at all. "I will not abandon a friendship that has clearly brought my brother more joy than he has known in years," the Duke said finally, "on the basis of a letter from a man who has made no secret of his own ambitions toward this family's fortune." "I am not asking you to abandon anything," Lady Beatrice said. "I am asking you to be cautious, Edmund, that is all. Watch her a while longer before you allow yourself to trust her completely. Surely that much is not unreasonable." It was not unreasonable, the Duke told himself later that night, alone in his study with a glass of brandy he did not particularly want. It was, in fact, the sensible course, the very course he had followed all his life, weighing every decision carefully before committing himself to it. And yet something about applying that same careful caution to Clara Bennet, to the memory of her laughter as she spun his brother clumsily around the dance floor, felt like a betrayal of something he could not quite name. He called upon her 3 days later than he had promised, and brought Lord Henry with him as he had said he would, though his own manner, try as he might to disguise it, carried a new reserve that Clara noticed almost immediately. They walked again through the small garden behind the shop, Lord Henry darting ahead of them to examine a bed of late roses, humming happily to himself, entirely unaware of the tension that had settled between his brother and his new friend. "You seem troubled, Your Grace," Clara said finally, unable to bear the careful distance in his conversation any longer. "Has something happened?" The Duke hesitated, and in that hesitation Clara felt something in her chest go cold, because she recognized, with the particular sharpness of someone who had spent her whole life reading the subtle shifts of people with more power than herself, exactly what that hesitation meant. "I have heard some concerns," the Duke said carefully, "regarding the nature of your friendship with my brother and with myself." "What sort of concerns?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew, could feel the shape of it forming even before he spoke the words aloud. "That your kindness toward Henry, however genuine it appeared, might have been offered with an eye toward gaining my attention and favor. That a young woman in your circumstances might find such an opportunity difficult to resist, whatever her true feelings toward my brother might be." Clara felt as though she had been struck. For a moment she could not speak at all, could only stare at him, searching his face for some sign that he did not truly believe what he had just said, that he was only repeating it to warn her of the gossip rather than to accuse her of it directly. But the careful distance remained in his eyes, and that alone told her everything she needed to know. "You believe this," she said quietly. It was not a question. "I do not know what to believe," the Duke admitted, and there was genuine misery in his voice now, the misery of a man caught between his own instincts and the careful doubt planted by someone he trusted. "I know only that I have known you a matter of days, Miss Bennet, and that I have very little on which to base my certainty beyond a single evening and a handful of conversations since." "Then perhaps," Clara said, and her voice trembled despite her best efforts to keep it steady, "you ought not to have come here at all, if a handful of whispered rumors is enough to undo whatever certainty you claimed to feel 3 days ago in this very garden." "Clara, I danced with your brother because he was standing alone in a room full of people who found him an embarrassment, Your Grace, and because I could not bear to watch it happen for one more moment. I did not know, when I offered him my hand, that his brother was a duke, nor did I care. I have gained nothing from this friendship save gossip that has followed me through every street in Elmsworth. And now, apparently, the suspicion of the very man whose good opinion I foolishly began to value." Lord Henry, drawn by the sharp edge in Clara's voice, had abandoned his examination of the roses and now stood watching the two of them with obvious confusion, his happy humming fallen silent. "Are you cross with Edmund?" he asked Clara, his brow furrowed with the particular worry of someone who did not fully understand the argument but understood perfectly well that something had gone wrong. "Please do not be cross. He is only careful. He is careful because people have been unkind to me before, and he does not want it to happen again." Clara's anger softened slightly at this, replaced by something closer to sorrow. "I know, Lord Henry, I am not cross with you. I could never be cross with you." "Then be cross with me instead," the Duke said quietly, "if you must be cross with someone because the fault is entirely mine. I should have trusted my own judgment rather than allowing doubt to be poured into my ear by someone with reasons of his own for wishing to see this friendship fail." "Whose doubt?" Clara asked, though something in the careful way he had phrased it already suggested an answer forming in her mind. The Duke hesitated only a moment before answering. "Lord Gerald has written to my aunt, suggesting precisely the concerns I have just repeated to you. I should not have given his words the weight I did. I see that clearly now, watching your face as I speak of it." Clara felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over her, cutting through the hurt of a moment before. "Lord Gerald asked me to dance the very same evening you did, Your Grace, and I refused him, using your brother's invented promise as my excuse. I did not think much of it at the time, beyond simple relief at having avoided an unwanted partner." But I begin to wonder now whether his letter to your aunt has rather less to do with genuine concern for your family, and rather more to do with wounded pride. The Duke's expression shifted rapidly through several emotions at once, surprise giving way swiftly to something harder, more focused. You refused him. I did not care for the way he looked at me, Clara said simply. It was not the way a gentleman looks at a lady he wishes to know better. It was the way a man looks at an obstacle he intends to remove. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, turning this new information over carefully in his mind, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had regained some of the warmth Clara remembered from the garden 3 days before. I owe you an apology far greater than the one I offered a moment ago, Miss Bennet. I allowed a man with clear motives of his own to plant doubt in a place where none belonged. I am sorry for it, more sorry than I can easily express. Apologies are easily given, Your Grace, Clara said, though the edge had gone out of her voice, and easily taken back again the next time someone whispers convincingly enough in your ear. Then I will simply have to prove myself steadier than my aunt's suspicions and Lord Gerald's ambitions combined, the Duke said, however long that proof requires. Lord Henry, sensing that the storm between them had passed, brightened immediately and darted forward to take Clara's hand, tugging her gently toward the roses. Come and see this one, Clara. It is the exact color of your gown from the ball. I have been telling it so every day since we arrived. Clara let herself be led, glancing back once toward the Duke, who watched them both with an expression of such open relief and tenderness that Clara felt the last of her hurt begin, cautiously, to soften into something warmer once again. But even as the afternoon settled into easier conversation and Lord Henry's delighted chatter, Clara could not entirely shake the cold unease that had settled in her stomach at the mention of Lord Gerald's letter. She had refused him a single dance, and in return he had moved swiftly and deliberately to poison a friendship that had only just begun to bloom. She wondered with growing apprehension what a man capable of such calculated cruelty over so small a slight might attempt next, now that his first effort had so narrowly failed. Lord Gerald did not take failure well, and he had failed twice now in as many weeks, first in his pursuit of a dance, then in his attempt to poison the Duke's growing trust in Clara Bennet. He sat in his rented rooms in town, a glass of brandy at his elbow, and turned the problem over in his mind with the same cold precision he applied to every difficulty in his life. He was not, whatever gossip might suggest, a wealthy man. His title was old, but his fortune had been dwindling for years, spent on tailors and card tables, and the particular expenses required to maintain the appearance of prosperity among people who would drop him instantly if they learned the truth. He had spent the better part of 3 years cultivating the Ashworth family's goodwill, positioning himself carefully as a trusted cousin, a sympathetic ear for Lady Beatrice's concerns, a steady presence at every gathering where the Duke's favor might eventually translate into the kind of financial rescue Lord Gerald desperately required. A shopkeeper's daughter, appearing from nowhere and somehow capturing the Duke's genuine affection within the span of a single evening, threatened every careful year of that cultivation. He needed a different approach, he decided, something more concrete than whispered doubts that could be so easily dismantled by a single honest conversation. He needed evidence, or, failing evidence, something that would appear convincingly like evidence to eyes already inclined toward suspicion. The opportunity presented itself sooner than he expected, in the form of Mr. Bennet's modest debts. It took only a few discreet inquiries to discover that Clara's father, like many shopkeepers in villages such as Elmsworth, occasionally borrowed against his stock to manage the lean months between seasons, small sums owed to a local merchant who dealt in such arrangements. It took only slightly more effort, and a not insignificant sum of Lord Gerald's own dwindling funds, to purchase that debt outright and hold it quietly in his own name, ready to be called due at whatever moment proved most useful. He did not act immediately. Patience, he had learned, produced far better results than haste, and so he waited, attending the same gatherings as the Duke and Clara, watching their friendship deepen with an outwardly pleasant smile that concealed the careful calculations turning behind it. The Duke's aunt, meanwhile, had begun, against her own better judgment, to soften slightly toward Clara. It happened gradually, over several visits, as Lady Beatrice observed the genuine transformation in Lord Henry, who had grown noticeably more confident since Clara's friendship began, speaking more freely at family dinners, even attempting small jokes that made the household staff laugh with obvious delight rather than the strained politeness they had once offered him. "I do not say I approve entirely," Lady Beatrice admitted to the Duke one evening, watching from the drawing-room window as Clara and Henry walked together in the garden below, deep in some conversation that made Henry laugh loudly enough to carry up through the glass. "But I begin to understand what you see in her, Edmund. She does not treat him as a burden to be managed. She treats him as a person worth knowing. That is all I have ever wanted for him," the Duke said quietly, "since the day the fever took him from us and gave him back changed." It was into this fragile, growing warmth that Lord Gerald finally chose to strike, at a garden party held at Wraxham Hall to mark the end of summer, attended by nearly every family of consequence within 20 miles. Clara had grown more comfortable in these gatherings over the past weeks, though she still felt occasional stabs of insecurity at the easy confidence of the guests around her, the effortless way they discussed matters of fashion and politics and family lineage that Clara had never been taught and could only follow by careful observation. She stood near a table of refreshments with Lord Henry, who was explaining, with great seriousness, his elaborate theory about why the garden's fountain made a different sound depending on the direction of the wind, when Lord Gerald approached, his smile as polished and dangerous as ever. "Miss Bennet," he said smoothly, "how well you look. Married life to a duke's brother's affections must suit you." "I am not certain I understand your meaning, Lord Gerald," Clara said carefully, aware immediately of the sharpened edge beneath his pleasant tone. "Only that it must be gratifying," Lord Gerald continued, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the small cluster of guests nearby, "to find oneself so warmly welcomed into a family of such standing, particularly given the circumstances of your father's finances. I understand debts can be a terrible burden on a family's dignity. How fortunate you are to have found such generous new friends to distract from them." The words landed like a slap, sharp and deliberate, and Clara felt the blood drain from her face as several nearby guests turned to look, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to something closer to scandalized interest. "I do not know what you mean," Clara said, though her voice had gone unsteady despite her best efforts. "Do you not?" Lord Gerald's smile widened, cruel now beneath its polish. "Your father's debt to Mr. Aldous Kemp, the merchant in Elmsworth. Rather a substantial sum, I understand, for a shop of such modest size. I wonder how a family in such straits came to raise a daughter so remarkably skilled at capturing the sympathy and the purse of a wealthy household." "That is enough." The Duke's voice cut sharply across the garden, and Clara turned to find him striding toward them, his face darker with anger than she had ever seen it, Lady Beatrice following close behind with an expression of open alarm. "Your Grace," Lord Gerald said, feigning surprise, though the satisfaction in his eyes did not fully disappear. "I only meant to offer Miss Bennet my sympathies regarding her family's financial difficulties. I did not realize the subject was forbidden." "You did not offer sympathy," the Duke said coldly. "You offered insult, dressed carefully enough to seem otherwise, in front of half the guests at my family's own gathering. I would ask you to explain yourself, Lord Gerald, and I would ask you to do so honestly, for once in your dealings with this family." Lord Gerald's composure flickered just briefly before he recovered it. "I meant no harm, Your Grace. I only thought it worth mentioning, given how remarkably well-timed Miss Bennet's kindness toward Lord Henry proved to be, that her family's circumstances might explain rather more of her motivation than romantic sentiment alone." Clara felt tears of humiliation and fury building behind her eyes, and she fought them back with every ounce of composure she possessed, unwilling to give Lord Gerald the satisfaction of watching her break down in front of the assembled guests. "My father's debts," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "are honest debts, owed for honest reasons, and they have absolutely nothing to do with why I danced with Lord Henry that evening. I did not know, when I offered him my hand, that his brother was a duke of any fortune at all. I knew only that a kind young man was being treated cruelly, and that I could not stand by and watch it." "A touching story," Lord Gerald said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence under the weight of the Duke's furious stare. "Though I confess I wonder how it happens that Mr. Kemp sold his interest in your father's debt only last month, to a buyer who requested his identity remain private." A murmur rippled through the gathered guests at this, and Clara felt her stomach drop, understanding with sudden, sick clarity where this revelation was heading, though she did not yet grasp its full shape. "What are you suggesting, Lord Gerald?" the Duke asked, his voice dangerously quiet now. "Only that it is a curious coincidence," Lord Gerald said, "that the very debt threatening this young woman's family should change hands so quietly, right around the time her friendship with your brother and yourself began to blossom so remarkably. One might almost suspect the debt itself was purchased deliberately, as leverage, should the friendship ever prove inconvenient to maintain." The Duke's expression had gone very still, very cold, and Clara watched with a mixture of dread and dawning understanding as he studied Lord Gerald's face with the particular focus of a man assembling a puzzle he had not wanted to see completed. "You are describing your own scheme, Lord Gerald," the Duke said slowly, "are you not? You purchased the debt yourself." The color drained from Lord Gerald's face all at once, his careful composure shattering entirely under the weight of the Duke's certainty. "I do not know what you—" "Do not insult me further by lying about it here in front of witnesses," the Duke said, his voice rising now, carrying clearly across the stunned garden. "You have spent weeks attempting to undermine a friendship that brought my brother more joy than he has known in years, first through whispered doubts to my aunt, and now, apparently, through financial threats against an innocent family, all because Miss Bennet had the good sense to refuse your attentions at a single ball." "Edmund," Lady Beatrice said quietly, laying a hand on her nephew's arm, though whether to calm him or to confirm her own dawning horror at Lord Gerald's true character, Clara could not tell. Lord Gerald's eyes darted around the silent garden, taking in the horrified faces of the assembled guests, the utter collapse of the careful reputation he had spent years constructing, and something desperate and dangerous flickered across his face, the look of a man who understood, in that single terrible moment, that he had lost everything he had worked so hard to build. "You will regret this," he said quietly, though whether the words were meant for the Duke or for Clara herself, neither of them could say for certain, and before anyone could respond, he turned sharply on his heel and strode from the garden, leaving behind a silence so complete that Clara could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The garden party did not recover its earlier gaiety after Lord Gerald's departure. Guests clustered in small, whispering groups, casting curious glances toward Clara and the Duke, though none dared approach directly, sensing correctly that something far more serious than ordinary gossip had just unfolded before them. "Come inside," the Duke said quietly to Clara, his hand finding hers without hesitation, entirely unconcerned now with who might witness the gesture. "You should not have to stand here and be stared at like an exhibit." He led her into the quiet of the library, away from the curious eyes of the garden, and Lady Beatrice followed close behind, her expression troubled in a way Clara had not seen before. "I owe you an apology as well, Miss Bennet," Lady Beatrice said once the heavy doors had closed behind them, cutting off the distant murmur of the party outside. "I encouraged Edmund toward caution when Lord Gerald first raised his concerns. I see now that my caution served only to give a dishonest man room to work his schemes unchallenged." "You could not have known his true character, my lady," Clara said, though her voice still trembled slightly from the confrontation. "Perhaps not," Lady Beatrice admitted. "But I ought to have trusted my own eyes rather than his letters. I have watched Henry these past weeks, Miss Bennet. I have watched him laugh more freely, speak more confidently, hold himself with a dignity I had feared he might never fully possess." Whatever your reasons for beginning this friendship, its effects have been nothing but good, and I was a fool to let a man like Lord Gerald convince me otherwise, even briefly." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes again, this time from relief rather than humiliation, and she was grateful when the Duke's hand tightened gently around hers. "The debt," the Duke said, his expression turning serious once more. "We must address it immediately. If Lord Gerald purchased it as leverage against your family, there is no telling what he might attempt now that his scheme has been exposed so publicly." "My father will be humiliated," Clara said quietly, "when he learns the debt has become the subject of gossip among half the county." "Your father need not be humiliated at all," the Duke said. "I will settle the debt myself, this very week, and Lord Gerald will find he has purchased nothing but his own disgrace for his trouble." "I cannot ask that of you, your grace." "You are not asking," the Duke said gently. "I am offering because it is the right thing to do, and because I will not allow a man like Lord Gerald to hold any power whatsoever over a family I have come to care for so deeply." Before Clara could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the library door and a breathless footman entered, his face pale with urgency. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption. There is a matter requiring your immediate attention." Lord Gerald was seen riding hard toward Elmsworth not a quarter-hour ago, and Mr. Finch believes he means to reach Mr. Kemp's establishment before word of this afternoon's events can travel there ahead of him. The Duke's face hardened instantly. "He means to call in the debt immediately, before I can settle it myself, hoping to ruin the Bennet family before I have the chance to intervene." Clara felt cold fear spread through her chest at the thought of her father facing such a demand alone, without warning, humiliated in front of his own shop and the neighbors who had known him for 20 years. "We must go to him." "We will," the Duke said, already moving toward the door, his earlier composure replaced now by a fierce, protective urgency that left no room for hesitation. "Finch, have the fastest carriage brought round immediately. Miss Bennet, will you ride with me? We may yet reach Elmsworth before Lord Gerald does irreparable damage." Clara did not hesitate. "Yes, of course." They rode hard through the darkening countryside, the carriage rattling over uneven roads at a pace that made Clara grip the seat with white-knuckled hands, though her fear for her father's dignity outweighed any concern for her own comfort. Beside her, the Duke sat rigid with tension, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the passing hedgerows as though he might will the horses to move faster through sheer determination alone. "He will not succeed," the Duke said, more to himself than to Clara, though the words seemed meant to reassure them both. "Whatever damage he attempts, it will not stand once the truth of his scheme is known publicly." "I am not afraid of the debt itself," Clara said quietly, watching the darkening fields blur past the window. "I am afraid of what it will do to my father to be confronted before his own neighbors, forced to admit a difficulty he has worked so hard to keep private." The Duke reached across the carriage and took her hand once more, and this time Clara did not pull away, grateful beyond words for the steady warmth of his grip. They reached Elmsworth just as the last light was fading from the sky, the village's narrow streets cast in long amber shadows, and Clara's heart climbed into her throat as she spotted a horse tethered outside her father's shop, its flanks still heaving from a hard ride. Inside, they found Lord Gerald standing at the counter, a folded document clutched in his hand, his face flushed with the particular desperation of a man who understood he was fighting a battle already lost, but could not bring himself to stop trying. Clara's father stood opposite him, pale and clearly shaken, her mother hovering anxiously nearby with a hand pressed to her mouth. "Your Grace," Lord Gerald's voice cracked slightly as the Duke strode through the door, Clara close behind him. "I was merely conducting legitimate business. Mr. Bennet owes a debt, and I am well within my rights to—" "You are within no rights at all," the Duke said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority now, cold and absolute. "You purchased that debt through deceit, concealing your identity precisely because you knew the moment it became known, your true purpose would be exposed for exactly what it is. Blackmail Lord Gerald dressed up as ordinary commerce." "That is a serious accusation," Lord Gerald said, though his voice had lost all its earlier confidence, thin now with barely concealed panic. "It is a serious matter," the Duke agreed. "Serious enough that I intend to lay the full account before the local magistrate first thing tomorrow morning, along with the testimony of every guest who witnessed your confession in my family's garden not 2 hours ago. I suspect you will find considerably less sympathy from the courts than you have found from society these past few years." Lord Gerald's face went ashen. He looked around the small shop, at Clara's frightened parents, at Clara herself standing tall and unflinching beside the Duke, and something in him seemed finally, completely, to break. "I only wanted what was owed to me," he said, his voice suddenly small, stripped of all its earlier polish. "Years of loyalty to this family, years of careful attention, and all of it swept aside in a single evening because a shopkeeper's daughter asked a simple boy to dance." "Do not speak of my brother that way," the Duke said, low and dangerous. "Not ever again in my presence or otherwise." Lord Gerald seemed to shrink under the weight of the Duke's fury, the folded document trembling visibly in his grip. For a long, tense moment, no one in the small shop moved at all, the only sound the frightened creak of Clara's father shifting his weight behind the counter. Then, without another word, Lord Gerald set the document down upon the counter, turned, and walked from the shop, his footsteps quick and unsteady on the wooden floor, the small bell above the door ringing out into the gathering dark as it swung shut behind him. Clara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and beside her, the Duke's shoulders finally relaxed, the tension of the ride and the confrontation draining slowly from his frame. "Papa," Clara crossed the small shop quickly to her father's side, taking his trembling hands in her own. "Are you well? He did not hurt you." "No, no," her father said, though his voice remained unsteady. "Only frightened me half to death, appearing here demanding immediate payment on a debt I had thought perfectly ordinary, threatening to seize the shop's stock if I could not settle it by morning." "You will not need to worry over it further," the Duke said gently, stepping forward. "The debt will be settled in full by tomorrow. Mr. Bennet and Lord Gerald will find himself facing considerably graver concerns than an unpaid account by week's end." Clara's mother, who had remained frozen with fear throughout the entire confrontation, finally found her voice, though it came out closer to a sob than a sentence. "Your Grace, we cannot possibly repay such kindness." "You need not repay anything," the Duke said, and then, glancing toward Clara with an expression of such open tenderness that her breath caught all over again despite the exhaustion of the evening, added quietly, "Your daughter has already given more to my family than any sum of money could ever repay." News of Lord Gerald's disgrace spread through the county faster than any gossip Clara had yet witnessed, though this time the whispers carried a very different character than those which had followed her own name only weeks before. Within days, the magistrate had taken formal statements from the guests who witnessed the confrontation in the garden, and Lord Gerald, faced with the certainty of prosecution for fraud and attempted extortion, quietly settled the debt himself, repaid every shilling he had spent purchasing it, and left the county entirely rather than face the full weight of the scandal his own scheming had created. Clara half expected the villagers of Elmsworth to view her with renewed suspicion, given how publicly her name had been dragged through the affair, but instead she found herself greeted with something closer to quiet respect. Mrs. Doyle, who had once approached the shop breathless with curious gossip, now spoke of Clara with open admiration to anyone who would listen, recounting the tale of Lord Gerald's downfall with considerable embellishment, until the story had grown, in the retelling, to something approaching legend. The Duke visited Elmsworth nearly every week after that, bringing Lord Henry with him each time, and the two brothers became so familiar a sight along the village lanes that even the youngest children learned to wave cheerfully at their passing carriage. Lord Henry, in particular, had blossomed remarkably in the months since the ball, his confidence growing steadily with each visit, until he had taken to greeting shopkeepers by name and asking after their families with a warmth that endeared him to the entire village. He is a different young man than the one who stood alone at that ball, Clara's Aunt Agnes observed one afternoon, watching from the shop window as Lord Henry helped an elderly widow carry her basket of vegetables across the street, chattering happily the entire way. I have never seen such a transformation in so short a time. He was always this way underneath, Clara said. He only needed people willing to see it. It was not only Lord Henry who had transformed, though Clara did not fully recognize the change in herself until her mother pointed it out one evening, watching Clara prepare for yet another visit to Wrexham Hall with a lightness in her step that had not been there before the ball. You carry yourself differently now, Clara, as though you belong wherever you happen to stand. Perhaps it was true. Clara had spent so many years believing herself unremarkable, a shopkeeper's daughter destined for a quiet, unremarkable life, that the Duke's steady attention and the genuine friendship that had grown between herself and Lord Henry had slowly rebuilt something in her that she had not even realized was missing. But not everyone in the Duke's circle had softened so readily. Though Lady Beatrice had come fully around to genuine affection for Clara, several of the more distant Ashworth relations remained coolly disapproving, whispering among themselves at family gatherings about the impropriety of a duke courting a tradesman's daughter, regardless of how nobly the friendship had begun. Clara felt the sting of this most acutely at a formal dinner held at Wrexham Hall to mark Lord Henry's birthday, an occasion the Duke had insisted upon celebrating properly for the first time in years, given how much his brother's spirits had improved. Clara had been seated near the foot of the long table, well below the family's more distinguished relations, and she overheard, quite by accident, a conversation between two elderly cousins that she suspected was not meant to reach her ears at all. "It is one thing to be kind to poor Henry," one cousin murmured to the other, barely bothering to lower her voice. "Quite another for Edmund to consider marriage. What will become of the family name, associated forever with a shop counter and bolts of ribbon?" Clara set down her fork carefully, her appetite gone entirely, and excused herself from the table as soon as propriety allowed, slipping out onto the terrace for air she suddenly found she needed rather desperately. The Duke found her there some minutes later, leaning against the stone balustrade, staring out at the darkened gardens with an expression he recognized immediately as distress carefully controlled. "Clara, what is it?" She hesitated, unwilling at first to burden him with the overheard conversation, but something in his steady, patient gaze convinced her that honesty, however uncomfortable, was owed between them. "I overheard your cousins discussing the impropriety of your courting a shopkeeper's daughter. I confess it struck rather deeper than I expected it to." The Duke's jaw tightened, though his voice remained gentle when he spoke. "My cousin's opinions have never once guided a single decision I have made regarding my own family or my own happiness, and I do not intend to begin allowing them influence now." "It is easy to say that," Clara said quietly, "but I wonder sometimes whether you truly understand what it would mean, practically, for a man of your position to marry so far beneath his expected station. The whispers would follow us for years, Edmund, perhaps for the whole of our lives." It was the first time she had used his given name without the title attached, and something in his expression shifted at the sound of it, softening even further. "Let them whisper," he said. "I have spent my entire adult life managing this estate, guarding my brother, meeting every expectation placed upon me by people who care more for lineage than for genuine happiness. I am tired, Clara, of living a life shaped entirely by other people's comfort rather than my own. I have found in you something I did not believe I would ever find at all, a partner who sees my brother clearly, who challenges me honestly, who makes me laugh in a way I had nearly forgotten how to do. I will not throw that away simply because a pair of elderly cousins find it inconvenient to their sense of propriety." Clara felt tears building behind her eyes, though this time they were tears of overwhelming feeling rather than hurt. "I am frightened, Edmund. Not of the whispers themselves, but of failing you somehow, of embarrassing your family despite my best efforts, of never quite belonging to this world the way I ought to if I am to stand beside you properly. You have never once failed to belong here. the Duke said firmly, taking her hands in his. From the very first evening, when you alone in that entire crowded room chose kindness over comfort, you have belonged here more completely than anyone born to this house by mere accident of birth. Titles and lineage teach a person how to bow correctly and which fork to use. They do not teach a person how to love. And you, Clara Bennet, understand love more completely than anyone I have ever known. Behind them, unnoticed by either, Lord Henry had wandered out onto the terrace in search of his brother, drawn by curiosity about the missing guests at his own birthday dinner. He stopped short at the sight of them standing so close together, hands clasped, and a slow, delighted smile spread across his face as understanding dawned. "Are you going to marry her, Edmund?" he asked, with the particular bluntness that had once made society wince and now, increasingly, made those who knew him smile with genuine fondness. "You should. She makes you happy. You laugh more now than you ever did before she came." The Duke turned, startled, and then laughed himself, a warm, unguarded sound that carried out over the quiet gardens. "Perhaps I should, Henry. Perhaps I should indeed." Clara's heart hammered wildly in her chest as she watched the Duke turn back toward her, something decided and certain now shining clearly in his eyes, and though he said nothing further that evening, choosing instead to simply draw her back inside to finish celebrating his brother's birthday properly, Clara understood, with a certainty that settled warm and steady in her chest, that whatever obstacles still remained between herself and a future with this remarkable family, they would face them together. And that alone made every whispered doubt of distant cousins feel very small indeed against the plain, undeniable truth of what had grown between them since that first, unexpected dance. The autumn ball that year was to be the grandest Wrexham Hall had hosted in a generation, and the entire county spoke of little else in the weeks leading up to it. Lady Beatrice, who had once fretted so anxiously over gossip and propriety, now threw herself into the preparations with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone who remembered her earlier caution, insisting on the finest musicians, the most elaborate flowers, and a guest list that included, for the first time in Ashworth family history, half the merchant families of Elmsworth alongside the usual nobility. "It seemed only right," she told Clara, when Clara expressed her surprise at the invitation extended to her own parents, "given how much this family owes to a shopkeeper's daughter who taught an old woman that kindness matters rather more than lineage." Clara arrived at the ball that evening in a gown of deep gold silk, a gift from the Duke that her mother had altered with such careful, loving stitches that Clara could hardly bear to look at it without tears threatening. It was nothing like the modest blue muslin she had worn to her very first ball at Wrexham Hall, and yet Clara found, standing at the top of the same marble staircase where she had once frozen with nervousness, that she felt none of the same uncertainty she had carried that first evening. She belonged here now, not because her gown had changed, but because everyone in that glittering room, from Lady Beatrice down to the youngest kitchen maid, had watched her prove it, again and again, through months of steady kindness and unwavering honesty. Lord Henry met her at the base of the stairs, resplendent in a new coat that he had clearly chosen with great care, his face alight with an excitement he could barely contain. "You look beautiful, Clara. Edmund has been pacing his study all afternoon. I think he is nervous about something, though he will not tell me what." Clara felt her own heart quicken at this, though she said nothing, only smiled and let Lord Henry lead her into the ballroom, where candlelight glittered across a sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces alike. The Duke found her within minutes, cutting through the crowd with the same purposeful stride she remembered from that very first evening, though his expression tonight carried none of the careful reserve of that earlier encounter. He looked, Clara thought, almost boyish in his eagerness, a far cry from the composed, guarded man she had first met across a crowded room. "Miss Bennet," he said, offering a formal bow that did not quite match the warmth in his eyes, "might I have the honor of this dance?" "You may, Your Grace," Clara said, curtsying with a small, teasing smile, and allowed him to lead her onto the floor just as the orchestra began the very same waltz they had shared that first remarkable night. They danced through 2 full songs before the Duke, rather than releasing her hand as the music ended, kept it firmly in his own and led her instead toward the center of the room, where the crowd, sensing something significant unfolding, began to fall quiet with the particular hush of anticipation. "I find myself standing in nearly the same spot," the Duke said, his voice carrying clearly now across the silent ballroom, "where I first watched a stranger show my brother more genuine kindness in a single dance than most of this room had offered him in years. I did not know that evening how completely that single kindness would change the course of my own life, but I know it now, with a certainty I have never felt about anything else." Clara's breath caught, her hand trembling slightly within his grip, and around them the entire ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath in anticipation. "Clara Bennett," the Duke continued, lowering himself slowly to one knee before her, drawing gasps from every corner of the crowded room, "you have taught this family more about true worth than any lineage ever could. You have given my brother a friendship he treasures beyond measure, and you have given me a kind of happiness I did not believe myself capable of feeling again after so many years of duty and careful caution. I love you, entirely and without reservation, and I would consider it the greatest honor of my life if you would consent to become my wife." Clara felt tears spill freely down her cheeks now, unable and unwilling to hold them back any longer, and she looked past the Duke's kneeling form to see Lord Henry standing just behind him, his own face streaked with happy tears, nodding encouragingly with such open joy that Clara found herself laughing even as she wept. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly on the single word, though it carried clearly enough for the entire silent ballroom to hear. "Yes, Edmund. I will marry you." The room erupted into applause and delighted exclamations, and the Duke rose swiftly to sweep Clara into his arms, entirely heedless now of the hundreds of watching eyes that had once caused him such careful reserve. Lord Henry rushed forward the moment they parted, throwing his arms around them both at once in an exuberant embrace that nearly toppled all three of them. "I knew it," he declared, loud enough for half the ballroom to hear, drawing warm laughter from the assembled guests. "I told Edmund he should marry you months ago. He only needed time to work up the courage to ask properly." "You did indeed tell me," the Duke admitted, laughing openly now, his composed reserve entirely dissolved into unguarded happiness. "And you were entirely right, as it turns out." Clara's parents pushed forward through the delighted crowd, her mother already weeping openly with joy, her father shaking the Duke's hand with such vigorous enthusiasm that Clara feared for his shoulder. Lady Beatrice approached more slowly, her expression carrying a warmth Clara would never have imagined possible from the woman who had once viewed her with such wary suspicion. "Welcome to this family properly, my dear," Lady Beatrice said, taking both of Clara's hands in her own. "You have earned your place here 100 times over, and I am only sorry it took me so long to see it clearly." The music resumed shortly after, the orchestra striking up a lively tune to match the celebration now filling the ballroom. And as Clara looked around at the glittering room full of familiar faces, from her own parents' overjoyed tears to Lady Beatrice's genuine warmth to Lord Henry's radiant, unfiltered joy, she found herself thinking back to that very first evening, when she had stood frozen at the top of the staircase, certain she did not belong among such grandeur and privilege. She understood now, with a certainty that settled warm and complete in her chest, that she had never needed to belong to their world in the way she had once believed. She had only needed to bring her own world, her own simple kindness and honesty, into theirs, and in doing so she had changed it, quietly but permanently, for the better. The Duke drew her back into his arms as the music swelled, and behind him, Lord Henry claimed the next dance from Clara's own mother with such earnest gallantry that the older woman laughed until tears ran freely down her cheeks once more, this time entirely from joy. "You danced with him first," the Duke murmured against Clara's ear as they moved together through the familiar steps of the waltz, when no one else in this entire room would spare him a single glance. "I do not think I will ever stop being grateful for that single act of courage." "It did not feel like courage at the time," Clara admitted softly. It only felt like the right thing to do. Perhaps, the Duke said, that is precisely what courage looks like when it is genuine. Not grand gestures made for an audience, but small, quiet choices made because they are right, regardless of who might be watching. Clara smiled up at him, her heart full to overflowing with a happiness she had never fully allowed herself to imagine possible. And as the music carried them across the same floor where their story had first begun, she understood that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face every one of them exactly as they had faced Lord Gerald's cruel scheming and society's careful whispers, together, steady, and entirely unafraid. Spring arrived at Wrexham Hall the following year with an abundance of blossoms that the head gardener declared the finest he had seen in 20 years of tending the estate's grounds. And the household staff whispered, with the particular fondness of servants who had come to love their new mistress dearly, that the gardens themselves seemed to be celebrating alongside the family. Clara's wedding to the Duke had taken place in the small stone chapel on the estate grounds, rather than the grand cathedral in town that many had expected, a choice Clara herself had requested, wishing to be married somewhere intimate enough that her parents would not feel dwarfed by grandeur on what ought to have been a day of simple joy. The chapel had been filled that morning with flowers gathered from the very garden where Clara and the Duke had first walked together, roses and late lavender arranged by Lord Henry himself, who had spent 3 full days selecting each bloom with a seriousness that touched everyone who witnessed it. He had also, at his own insistence, walked Clara down the short aisle himself, since her own father had confided quietly to the Duke that he did not trust his own composure to manage the task without breaking into tears halfway through. Lord Henry had taken the responsibility with tremendous solemnity, his arm steady beneath Clara's hand, though his face had glowed with such unrestrained happiness that half the small gathered congregation found themselves smiling through their own tears before the ceremony had even properly begun. "You are the first person who ever saw me clearly," he had whispered to Clara as they walked, so quietly that only she could hear it. "I will love you like a sister for the whole of my life, for that alone." A year into their marriage, Clara had settled into life at Wrexham Hall with a comfort that surprised even herself, though she had insisted, against the mild protests of Lady Beatrice, on keeping close ties to Elmsworth, visiting her parents' shop nearly every week, and bringing Lord Henry along whenever he wished to come, which was almost always. The village had grown accustomed to seeing the Duke's carriage rolling regularly through its narrow streets, and what had once seemed an impossible scandal, a Duke married to a shopkeeper's daughter, had become instead a source of quiet local pride, spoken of warmly at the village assemblies as proof that kindness, wherever it began, could travel further than anyone expected. Lord Henry, meanwhile, had continued to flourish in ways that delighted everyone who had known him during his more difficult years. He had taken a particular interest in the estate's gardens, working alongside the head gardener with such genuine enthusiasm and growing skill that by the following autumn, an entire section of the grounds had been given over to his care entirely, a project he approached with the same fierce, joyful dedication he brought to everything he loved. Visitors to Wrexham Hall often remarked on the particular beauty of what had become known throughout the county as Lord Henry's garden, never realizing quite how much quiet triumph lay behind every carefully tended row of flowers. He had also, much to Clara's delight and the Duke's initial mild alarm, taken to organizing small dances of his own within the household, insisting that every servant, regardless of station, deserved at least one evening a season where music played, and no one was made to feel unwelcome on the floor. The first of these gatherings had been awkward, uncertain, much like Clara's own first evening at Wrexham Hall, but Lord Henry had approached each hesitant guest personally, exactly as Clara had once approached him, and within a few seasons, these gatherings had become one of the most beloved traditions among the entire household staff. It was at one such gathering, held in the servants' hall on a cold evening in early winter, that Clara found herself standing beside the Duke, watching Lord Henry lead a shy young kitchen maid through her very first dance with the same patient, careful attention Clara had once shown him. "He has become quite the teacher," the Duke observed, watching his brother with open pride. He always understood what it meant to be overlooked, Clara said softly. I think that understanding has made him kinder than anyone else I have ever known. The Duke slipped his arm around her waist, and together they watched as Lord Henry's patient encouragement finally coaxed a genuine, delighted laugh from his nervous young partner, the sound carrying warmly through the crowded hall. Do you ever regret it? The Duke asked quietly, after a moment, leaving behind the quiet life you might have had, for all the complications that came with joining this family. Clara considered the question seriously, though she did not need long to find her answer. She thought of Lord Gerald, whose scheming had once threatened to unravel everything before it had properly begun, now living in quiet disgrace in some distant county, his name rarely spoken except as a cautionary tale. She thought of Lady Beatrice, who had grown into one of her dearest confidants, and of her own parents, whose modest shop now enjoyed a steady stream of new customers curious to meet the family that had raised a duke's wife. She thought most of all of Lord Henry, laughing freely across the crowded hall, utterly transformed from the lonely young man who had once stood alone in a ballroom, hoping desperately that someone, anyone, might see him for who he truly was. No, Clara said finally, resting her head against the Duke's shoulder. I do not regret a single moment of it, not even the difficult ones. I think perhaps the difficult moments were what made everything that followed feel so genuinely earned. I love you, the Duke said simply, pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head, entirely unconcerned with the servants and guests who might witness such tenderness between the Duke of Wrexham and his wife. I have loved you, I think, since the very moment I watched you offer my brother your hand when no one else in that entire room would spare him a second glance. And I love you, Clara said, though I confess my heart belonged to your brother first, in its own particular way, long before it ever belonged to you. The Duke laughed at this, warm and unguarded, exactly the sort of laugh Clara had first glimpsed only in careful, private moments, and now heard often, freely, throughout every corner of Wrexham Hall. I do not mind sharing you with him in the slightest. He has earned every bit of the devotion you show him, and honestly, I suspect I owe him a debt of gratitude I can never fully repay, for it was watching him dance that evening that first showed me exactly who you truly were. Across the hall, Lord Henry caught sight of them watching him and waved enthusiastically, abandoning his current partner momentarily to hurry over, breathless with excitement. Clara, will you dance with me again, for old times the way we did that very first night? Clara laughed, delighted, and allowed him to pull her onto the floor, the Duke watching with open, unguarded fondness as his brother led his wife through the same clumsy, joyful steps that had begun everything so many months before. The musicians struck up the very same reel, whether by coincidence or by Lord Henry's own careful request, and as Clara spun beneath the warm candlelight of the servants' hall, surrounded by the family and friends who had once seemed impossibly distant, and now felt entirely, completely her own, she understood with perfect clarity that a single act of kindness, offered without expectation of reward, had grown into a life she could never have imagined possible on that first uncertain evening. Lord Henry missed a step, just as he had that very first night, and laughed loudly at his own mistake, entirely unashamed, and Clara laughed with him, catching his arm to steady him exactly as she had done before. Around them, the whole gathered household clapped and cheered, and somewhere in the warm, candle-lit chaos of the celebration, Clara caught the Duke's eye across the room, watching them both with an expression of such complete, quiet happiness that she felt certain, in that single perfect moment, that every difficult step of their unlikely journey had led them exactly where they were always meant to be.